Given your experience in negotiating with some of the most powerful and influential leaders in the world, what's the key to negotiating difficult agreements in geopolitics? Let's start with a big question.
If I look back on the different negotiations I had when I was in government, either with leaders of countries, with representatives of leaders, or even with members of Congress to pass legislation, the most important thing I would draw back to would be trust. I think getting to know each other, understanding what was motivating the other party to get to the outcome, and making them feel like you weren't going to use whatever information they gave you to benefit yourself at the expense of them is probably what I would call table stakes to have a shot at accomplishing anything that was hard in a negotiation. After that, I would say taking maybe a first principles approach to what the outcome of whatever problem you're looking to solve should be. Now, you have different kinds of negotiations. I always tried to create a framework in the negotiation where it wasn't me against you. It was always, let's agree on what the outcome is that we're trying to accomplish. Let's all sit on the same side of the table and say, we want to get to this outcome. How do we get there? Really trying to create a roadmap. And so once you understand the destination you want to get to, the endpoint, then you'd have to work backwards and really try to put yourself in their shoes and try to understand what were their motivations macro. Most of the time, you have to assume that a leader's primary objective was to stay in power. And so all decisions made would be made through the framework of what it would take to do that and how it would impact their ability to do that. And then finally, I would just say that in any negotiation, you have to understand the power dynamics as well. And you have to then weight your approach in order to maneuver pieces to accomplish the objective. And so in areas where we had stronger power dynamics, I'd always look at it and say, what are the potential escape routes where a politician would say, this is just the reason why we can't get there? And I'd always think, how can you try to eliminate those escape routes or make them much harder to accomplish? And then ultimately think about what's the golden bridge that you want to create for them in order to get to the other side where they were motivated to get there because it was in their self-interest to get there, but also because it helped accomplish the different objective. And I have many examples that I lived through with that. Obviously, negotiating in Congress for prison reform, I had to form a lot of trust with Democrats, whether it was Hakeem Jeffries or Dick Durbin, and then also on the Republican side with I had Mike Lee, I had Lindsey Graham, I had Tim Scott, Senator Grassley, and then also Doug Collins in the House was tremendous. And, every time we maneuvered something, we would get attacked either from the left. There was a time we were being attacked by, Nancy Pelosi, John Lewis, for not being, inclusive enough. And then there were times that we maneuvered it, we'd be attacked from the right for maybe going too far. And ultimately, we had to find just the right place where we can get it done. And the same thing happened with USMCA, where we were negotiating the biggest trade deal in the history of the world, which was $1.3 trillion in annual trade between Mexico, Canada, the United States of America. And we were able to form good trust with the other side and try to say, how do we create win-win outcomes? And ultimately, we were able to do something in a record time that people thought was very hard to do. And both of them, in a divided time of the Trump administration, were bipartisan wins with big votes in the Senate and the House.
You have a lot of stories of this kind. Sometimes a soft approach, sometimes a hard approach. Like there's, I think, a story where with Bibi, there was a potential, like a dramatic election coming up, and you had to say no excuses, no delaying. We have to make this agreement. I know Bibi cares about Israel more than the particular dynamics of the election. Like you have to draw a hard line there.
Yeah, but in fairness too, for him, during the time that we were dealing with him, he was always in election versus election and then election. And, what he was saying wasn't wrong. And I think he was more expressing his concerns given the dynamics. And, we never held those concerns against him. We just said those are real concerns he had. We respected those concerns, but then we helped him prioritize to help accomplish the right things. And that's ultimately what the partnership is, right? My job was to represent America. His job was to represent Israel. And you had other parties representing their own interests. And as long as you assume that, people were acting mostly in good faith, you were able to navigate areas where you didn't have, complete overlap of priorities and objectives.
Just to go back to the trust thing, you sometimes see that with leaders where they're kind of, it looks like they're trying to screw over the other person when they're talking. And so not having that, I think, is a really powerful thing for earning trust. Like that people actually can believe that you're results driven and are working towards a certain end. Is there like a skill to that? Like what is that, genetics? You're born with that, or is that something like you develop? So basically, it requires you to look at the game of politics and not have a kind of cynicism about it, to where everybody's trying to manipulate you, and actually just go in with a kind of open mind and open heart and actually speak truthfully to people, like on a basic human level.
I would say that I always would think about how can I be a partner to others like I would want somebody to be a partner to me. And a lot of it comes from just my different experiences. In business, I've had great partners. I've had terrible partners. My father, again, a lot of my childhood was I was exposed to business. My father, on Sundays, he would take us to job sites and to the office with him instead of to football games like my friends, fathers would do. And so we were exposed to business. And what he would say about his father, who was an immigrant to America, came over with nothing and no formal education. But he would always say, a good deal with a bad partner will always be a bad deal. And a bad deal with a good partner, you'll figure it out. And so going through some of the challenges that I had in my life early on, whether it was the issue with my father that I'm sure we'll talk about, or even going through some tougher financial times during the great financial crisis, I really learned a lot about partnership. And I always thought, how can I act in a way where I could be the type of partner or friend to others that I wish others would be to me?
So when you look for a good partner, don't you think there's the capacity for both good and bad in every person? So when you negotiate with all of these leaders, aren't there like multiple people you're speaking to inside one person that you're trying to encourage, catalyze like the goodness in the human?
Yeah. Leaders are generally chosen by their country. And so my view was, if I had an objective, I didn't get to choose who was the leader of other countries. My job was to deal with that leader, understand their strengths, understand their weaknesses, understand their power dynamics as well. One of my greatest takeaways when I grew up, I'd read the newspapers about all these powerful, famous people. And then as I got older and had the chance to meet them and do business with them, and then ultimately, interact with them in government, is I realized that they're just like you and me. They wake up every morning, their kids are pissed at them, their wife doesn't want to talk with them, and they've got, a set of advisors around them. One saying, let's go to war, one saying, let's make peace, one saying, do the deal, one saying, don't do the deal. And they're all thinking, where do I get advice? How do I make decisions? And so understanding the true human nature of them and then the different power dynamics around them, I thought was very key. And so I didn't have a choice, do I deal with them or not? It was a function of how do you deal with them effectively in order to find areas where you have common interests and then work well together to pursue those common interests in order to achieve a certain goal.
You, first of all, you're incredibly well read. I've gotten to know you and I've gotten to know Ivanka, and the book recommendation list is just incredible. So first of all, thank you for that. You told me about The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. It's a book on World War One, and I went down a whole rabbit hole there. She's like an incredible historian. But anyway, there's a bunch of stuff you learn from that. But one of the things you told me is it influenced your general approach to diplomacy of just picking up the phone and giving it a try. So as opposed to planning and strategizing, just pick up the phone.
Yeah, so this was a book I read way before the notion of serving in government was ever even on my mind or a reality. And I remember thinking about it, reading it, and thinking how World War I started, where you had somebody was assassinated, and then you had all these different alliances that were created, and then in order to accomplish objectives, it triggered all of these uh, people getting in bed with everyone else because of documents that were created without the intent of going to a massive war. And I think in the course of World War I, it was one of the greatest atrocities that we've seen as humanity. We've had 16 million people killed in that war. And as I was reading the book, I remember thinking to myself, even though, things are set in a certain way, go sit with somebody, go talk to them and say, this doesn't make sense. This is wrong. How do we create a better pathway?
Mhm.
And as a civilian, all my life, I would read the newspapers. I would, observe how different leaders would act. But when we had the opportunity to serve in government and have the position, you realize you're not a civilian. You don't have the luxury of sitting back and letting the world happen the way it's happening. You have agency and you have the potential to influence the outcome of things. And one thing I've seen is, most political prognosticators are wrong. Anyone who tells you what's going to happen really has no clue. And it's not because they're bad or they're not intelligent. It's because nobody knows. And at the end of the day, the outcomes in the world are usually driven by the decisions of humans. And if you're able to come together, form relationships, listen to each other, you can do that. And one of the great examples that I speak about in the book is with North Korea. Whereas if you remember in 2017, it was very intense. When President Obama was leaving office, he told President Trump that the single biggest fear that he had, and this is a time when the world was a mess. You had the Middle East was on fire. ISIS was beheading journalists and killing Christians. They had a caliphate the size of Ohio. Libya was destabilized. Yemen was destabilized. Syria was in a civil war where 500,000 people were killed. Iran was on a glide path to a nuclear weapon. Yet the single biggest fear he had was North Korea. And then it got compounded by the fact that we get into office and President Trump brings his generals around and he's, learning how to interact with all the generals and says, okay, what are my options? And they said, calm down. We've been using all of our ammunition in the Middle East. We don't have enough ammunition to go to war over there. And he says, let's not let that be too public. Let's try to restock and come up with a plan.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was a lot of banter back and forth. And I was able to. I got a call from a friend who was an old business contact who actually had done business in North Korea, and he said, I'd love to find a way to solve this. And I was getting calls from friends at the time saying, I'm trying to go to Hawaii for vacation. Should I not be going? Is it not safe? I mean, we forget the psychology of how intense that was at the time. And then through that interaction, he called some of his contacts in North Korea, and then we were able with the CIA to open up a back channel that ultimately led to the de-escalation, the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, which led to a de-escalation. So that was really the mindset, which was whenever there's a problem, just pick up the phone and try. And I think President Trump had a very similar approach, which was let's give it a shot. And he wasn't afraid to go after the hard ones too. And I'll say one final thing on this, which is that in politics, the incentive structure is just much different than in the real world, right? In the sense that you have a hard problem, then if you try to solve a hard problem, the likelihood of failure is great. Whereas in the business world, if you're going after a hard problem, we celebrate those people, right? We want our entrepreneurs and our great people to go after solving the big hard problems. But in politics, if you try to take on a hard problem, you have a high likelihood of failure. You'll get a lot of criticism on your pathway to trying to accomplish that if you fail. And then if you fail, it has a higher probability of leading to you losing your opportunity to serve. And so it's just one of these things where people want to play it safe, which is not the notion that really was taken during the time that President Trump was in office.
Do you think it has to be that way? I think there's something in the human spirit, like in the public, that desires politicians to take on the big, bold problems, right? Like why is it the politicians need to be so afraid of failure?
I don't think it has to be that way. And that's, I think, one of the great lessons from the time of the Trump administration. He brought a lot of people from the business world into government. The business people have a much different mindset than government people. And there was a lot of resistance. And I think part of why there was so much resistance was because, I think about it from my personal sense, was that if I was successful with no traditional qualifications to do diplomacy, it meant that all the people with traditional qualifications in diplomacy didn't necessarily need those qualifications in order to be successful. And that same sentiment manifested itself in many areas in government. And I think that in the business world, it's outcome oriented, it's results oriented. And what we would see in New York is they would stab you in the eye. In DC, they would stab you in the back. And it just became a whole different dynamic of how you work through these different areas. So the answer is it doesn't have to be that way. You just need the right courageous leader. And that's why I'm so optimistic about what the future of America and the world could be if you have the right people in power who are willing to take on the right challenges and do it in the right way.
So if we just linger on the North Korea and the de-escalation and the meeting, what's the trajectory from this could be the most catastrophic thing that destroys the world to you find back channels, you start talking and start arranging the meeting? Like, is there some insights you can give to how difficult that is to do in the North Korea case, which seems like to be one of the more closed off parts of the world, and in the other cases that you worked on?
Yeah, it's always very challenging, and especially when you're going against the grain of what's established, right? We did something different to think that an old business contact that I had
Sure.
could then do it. I mean, that's the type of thing that, if the press knew what we were doing, they would have, derided it and criticized it in every which way.
Hmm.
But that was one of the benefits of operating very much below the radar, is that we were able to try all these different things, and not all of them worked, but some of them did. And, but that is what's amazing about the world, right? This could be the biggest story on the front page of every paper, and they're inciting fear in everyone. And it's not illegitimate fear. I mean, there were missile tests, over Japan. I mean, you had a lot of very big challenges with that file. And then all of a sudden we make contact. We go through negotiations to set a meeting. There's a meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. And then all of a sudden there's a framework to try and move things forward. And again, I think that there's a lot of possibility there for what could happen if it's worked in the right way.
I just want to know, like, how you word that first email or text message, like what emojis to use, like the hugging emoji. I mean, it's just personally, I've gotten to know a lot of powerful and rich people, and it's funny that they're all human, just like you're saying. And like a lot of the drama, a lot of the problems can be resolved with just like a little camaraderie, a little kindness, a little just reaching out.
We're all human beings, and people want to be successful, and people want to be good, and you're right too. There's way more emojis involved in diplomacy than I ever would have expected. But
and every leader, I'm sure, has their favorite emoji. This is also I learned about people. They use there's everybody has their go-to emoji. Like I usually go to the heart very quickly emoji. There's some people who go the hugging, where you're like doing the hugging thing. Anyway. This conversation quickly turned to the ridiculous. But to do another book reference, you mentioned the book 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright, in discussing all the work you've done in Israel and the Middle East. I just want to ask you sort of the interesting aspect of that book, which is the influence of the personalities and personal relationships on these negotiations. You kind of started to allude to that with the trust, but how much do the personalities matter in this? So going from North Korea to the Middle East here to within Congress and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, completely in every way. I mean, that's an incredible book, and it's a very entertaining read. It has obviously a lot of good historical context on some of the key players, whether it was Anwar Sadat or Menachem Begin or Jimmy Carter and Cy Vance and a lot of the others who were involved with those negotiations. And the thing that I kind of took from that experience was just how personal it was. And again, one of my favorite stories from that book was how Anwar Sadat, who was a big leader, he had a mystic who was, according to this book, again, history, I like reading it, but I always, realize that you have to notice that this is just the perspective of a given author that's writing it. But the way that they write this book was that he had an advisor who was a mystic, and the mystic was having a back channel with the Israelis. And the mystic told Sadat, if you go to Israel and you make a speech at the Knesset, Begin is ready to give you the Sinai. And so he goes to Israel. They set this whole thing up. He goes and gives the Knesset. They go for their meeting after. And Sadat says, okay, well, are we going to do this thing? And Begin says, what are you talking about? I'm not giving you an inch of our land. And it was just one of these things where it was a miscommunication that brought about the symbolic visit of Anwar Sadat to Israel. And that was one of these notions that just made everyone think that something was possible that they thought was impossible a moment before. And actually, we had an example like that during our time in government when we did the Abraham Accords. The first step of the Accords was really a phone call between President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Mohammed bin Zayed, who at that point was the crown prince and de facto ruler of the UAE. But all we had was a phone call and then a statement that was released. And what was interesting after that is we said, okay, well, how do we integrate countries? Nobody's done this in a long time. And we were trying to figure out all the issues. And there's big miscommunications between Israel and UAE. And we were navigating through all the issues. And so after a couple weeks, I said, you know what, I've got to go over there and try to sort through these issues. So we make a plan to go to Israel, then we can go to UAE. And then a young gentleman who worked with me named Avi Berkowitz says, well, if we're flying from Israel to UAE, instead of flying on a government plane, why don't we see if we can get an El Al plane and we'll do the first official commercial flight? And so I said, that's a great idea. Let's call, Ambassador Taiba Youssef, who was a tremendous player in the Abraham Accords, working behind the scenes, day and night, and was really a big catalyst. So he calls Youssef and he said, sure, no problem. Let's give it a shot. So we go and we do it. And he says, if we can work out these issues, we'll do it. So we go to Israel, we do our meetings, we get everything back into a good place. We set up this trip over. We fly in an El Al plane. We fill it up. At the time, it was during COVID, with a health delegation. We had the financial ministry, because we had to open up banking relationships so they could wire money between countries. We wanted to get health partnerships. Then we just had a lot of legal things and national security things we wanted to start putting together. So we do this flight, and we end up landing in UAE. And the picture of us coming off the plane being greeted by Emiratis and Tobes with a El Al plane with an Israeli flag on it just captured everyone's imagination. And so it was one of these things where it's like you work so hard on the details and the negotiation. I mean, hundreds of hours to kind of make sure everything's perfect. And the one thing that you do kind of, let's give it a shot, that image ended up capturing everyone's heart. So going back to Sadat, that visit was very critical. And what was interesting is, according to this book, it happened because of a miscommunication. Mm-hmm. That was the first part. The second part of the book, that's just amazing theater. And actually the book was based on a play. It was just going back and forth with all of the different methodologies that they tried that failed, but they kept trying out it. And then ultimately seeing how the personalities were able to find ways to make the compromise that ultimately was a very, very big thing for more stability in the Middle East. And so amazing book. I would highly recommend it. A very entertaining read, and something that at least gave me encouragement to keep going when the task I was pursuing seemed so large.
I mean, if we could just linger on the personalities, you write in the book that words matter, or you write in the context of saying in the diplomacy business, words matter. And then you said that we're in the results business. It's a badass line, but if we just stick to the diplomacy business and words mattering, it seems like one of the things you really highlight, that individual words can really have, like, you can fight over individual words. So like, how do you operate in a world where like single words matter?
I think you have to be respectful to the craft that you're in, where words matter, but then realize that they don't matter as much. And then also focus on the fact that, the actions are actually what's going to matter more than the words. And so you have a difference between leaders and politicians. Politicians are there to say the right thing and to hold the power. Leaders are people who are willing to do things that will be transformational from my perspective. And so when I would think about diplomacy, words without actions or without the threat of actions, and that was something that President Trump did very well, was that people knew that he was willing to take action. He was very unpredictable in how he would act, and that made our words much more effective in what they did. So it's all a combination. But, coming from the private sector, we were all about results, right? If you're in government, you can work on something for 10 years and fail and then retire, and they consider you an expert. In the private sector, if you work on something for 10 weeks and you don't have a success, then you're unemployed, So it's a different kind of notion. And it was just understanding the mentality and trying to adjust and bridging the divides between the different trainings.
Is that the biggest thing you took from your business background? Is that just be really results focused?
It was just the only way to be. I mean, if I was giving up, a nice life in New York, and if I was giving up, the stuff that I really enjoyed, the company that I'd helped build, and the life that I was enjoying in order to do government, I was going there to make a difference, and we had to focus on it. The other skill set, so there was a couple skill sets that I found were quite deficient in government. First of all, there was a ton of amazing people. I mean, people talk about the bureaucracy. What I found is you had incredibly committed, passionate, intelligent, capable people all throughout the government. And what they were waiting for, though, was direction and then cover in order to get there. And so there were a lot of tasks that I worked on, whether it was, building the wall at the southern border, where I was able to work with, Customs Border Patrol, Army Corps of Engineers, military, DHS professionals, DOD. And we basically all came together. And then once we had a good project management plan, we were able to kind of move very, very quickly. I think we built about 470 miles of border barrier in about 2 years, basically. And that worked very well because we basically brought private sector project management skill sets, which were quite often missing in government. The second one is just, we spoke about negotiation earlier. I would say that most people in government, it's just a different form of negotiation than you see in the private sector, and way less effective in that regard, which is why I think it's good the more we can encourage more people with private sector experience to do a stint in government and to really try to contribute and serve their country. That's how our founders, George Washington and all the founding fathers, they were working on their farms. They left their farms serving government, then they went back to the farm. And that was kind of the design of, the representative government. It wasn't a career political class. It was, people coming in to, show gratitude for the freedoms and the liberties that they enjoyed. And then, do their best to kind of, help others have those same opportunities that they had. And then they'd go back and live their lives. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity with our government if people with more business mindsets who are going to think about things from a solutions perspective go and serve.